finding power in the silences created in the Constitution. Basically, where the Constitution doesn't say what the president cannot do, much in the way in every other aspect of the Constitution, individuals seeking to use power found avenues to do so. And part of the power that has been enduring, the enduring aspect of FDR's tactics, even without this epic crisis of a Great Depression, modern presidents have adopted them. And so what are these tactics? I'm going to share a PowerPoint, some information. Hang on one second. Okay, can everybody see? All right, awesome. Okay. All right, so what did FDR provide for us that we see today in the modern presidency that is part, or is basically what we consider the modern presidency? The first aspect is that presidents actually have an agenda. Now, this agenda comes from the campaign, and this all sounds perfectly normal to us, that presidents come in, they campaign, they tell us what they want to do and what they're going to be doing there. And that is not normal prior to FDR. It was not a component necessarily, the president having his own agenda. And part of that agenda is that the president is going to be legislatively active, meaning that the president is going to try to lead Congress to produce legislation that advances that agenda. In addition to that, FDR gave us an expanded and expansive institution. And this institution provides the president with advantages to work with the tools that he has available to him. And then finally, the recognition of the value of us, how we can help the president achieve the president's goals, and that we are a tool to factor in to being able to get Congress to do what the president wants, which is pass the presidential agenda. So that 100-day success that FDR, produced, and the fascinating thing, if anybody has an opportunity to study this period of history, it's amazing what happened during his first two terms. You may have heard of his fireside chats, where rather than being on TV, because they didn't have television in everybody's home like they do today, he went on the radio, and they were called fireside chats because he was sitting beside his lovely fireplace. In his first fireside chat, what did he do? He told the American people that the banks were safe and they can take their money out from underneath their mattress and put them back in the bank. And in doing so, FDR changed everything, because suddenly the banks were solvent, and there were no longer runs on the banks, and bank failures came to an end. Now, there was legislation, one of those 15 bills dealt with banking, but he solved the problem by talking to us and telling us that it was going to be okay. This was new, this was different, and it was powerful. So this working with the public to reassure us and to bring us along to try to solve this crisis, plus these 15 bills, made this 100-day period, it made us change the way we view the president. And it really made us understand the president's role differently in the political system. The press, us, other political actors, we now all expect that a president is going to be successful in their first 100 days, or at least active in their first 100 days to accomplish something. And that waiting for an active president to what you would call hit the ground running is what produces that term, the honeymoon period, which is what Biden is in right now. And the honeymoon, as we understand it, is the leeway, the willingness to give a president this time to try to accomplish what they want to accomplish. Now, this isn't a complete laying down of, just basically saying, okay, new president, we're going to do whatever the new president wants. But it's a recognition that you've just campaigned for a year, maybe longer, and that perspective won. And so the new president gets a chance to accomplish something. And that 100-day period gifted to us by FDR, plus the 2-year electoral cycle, because Congress, of course, we get a new term every 2 years. The House of Representatives, their members are up for office every 2 years. This means that we get this sort of presidential timing, presidential calendar for activity when we expect policy making. And this is what we're in right now. And so when you take those 100 days and you take those 2 years, scholars, we've learned that we've learned a lot about the potential for presidential success. When can presidents succeed, and what makes them succeed? What contributes to their success? And one of my favorite scholars who worked on this a long time ago, but it's still really interesting today, really applicable, is from a guy named Paul Light, who's now at Brookings. And this is my PowerPoint version of his graph, which is, it's got a few bumps in it, so just ignore that part. But he argued way back in 1982 that presidents experience 2 simultaneous cycles. So you have the cycle of presidential influence and the cycle of presidential effectiveness. And this is what happens over time. And so increasing in presidential effectiveness, you can, I think I did this backwards. Yeah, I labeled it incorrectly. So that's lovely. Thank you. Anyway, so actually I'm going to, all right. I'm going to take 2 seconds and correct this because it's going to bug me. And it won't make any sense if I don't. So, all right. Sorry. All right, and now, slide. Oops. Okay, I'm going back. All right, now we're gonna share screen again, and you're gonna see how awesome this graph is. Okay, so how effective is the president? See, now it increases over time. Presidential effectiveness increases over time. In that you can expect presidents and their staffs to get better at doing the job, just like we all do. The longer you do something, seemingly you get better at it. Presidential influence, though, this is a cycle of decreasing influence because this is about presidential capital, presidential time, and presidential energy, all the things that presidents expend over time, in that the longer you're in office, the more exposed you are, the more, the less leeway you have. It's sort of a evidence of the declining honeymoon over time. And so, but you notice there's a magic point here in year 2 where the president's skill level meets the president's available capital and effectiveness. And that's why the time between in year 1 and year 2, presidents have more policy success in Congress because of the honeymoon. But at the same time, you're coupled with the fact that they're not as good at the job yet and are more apt to make mistakes. Their staff is more apt to make mistakes. And so what happens is, over time, you're losing any goodwill and grace that you may have had, but you better understand how to work the system. Theoretically, that's what happens with most presidents. And Light actually quotes an aide to President Ford, who had a pretty difficult time, but he said that this aide argued, each decision is bound to hurt somebody. Each appointment is going to cut into support. There's really no way that the president can win. If he doesn't make choices, he will be attacked for being indecisive. If he does, he will satisfy one group, but anger 3 others. And so over time, the more exposed you are, the more this influence declines. And the other thing is also, and this is very applicable for understanding President Trump, the more you behave, the more you teach people about how you behave. I mean, you can argue this is true in life too. Every decision then is irritating some people, but it also, or pleasing others, but it's also creating expectations of behavior for the next time. And so when we think about this and we think about the president's agenda, we're thinking typically about how the president works with Congress. But there's another side to the president's job, and that is the fact of why we have a president in the first place. And that is, an individual was added because we needed somebody to manage the bureaucracy, to manage the executive branch, and to see to it, as the oath says, that the laws are faithfully executed. And the president's mechanisms for doing this, and I'm going to talk about that, are not something the public pays an awful lot of attention to. But increasingly, presidents have been using this behavior in order to compensate for how difficult it is to be successful with Congress. So we have these 2 paths that presidents can try to accomplish their policy goals. So we'll start with the first side of it in terms of Congress and legislation. Why is it so hard for presidents to succeed legislatively if they just won an election campaigning on doing this stuff? There are tons and tons of reasons, but primarily, and we're really experiencing this right now, is when you win, there are a lot of disappointed people whose candidate have just lost. So while the winning president enters office with a larger coalition, obviously, than the losing candidate, that electoral coalition, that group of people that produced the win, doesn't always translate into what we would call a governing coalition, because it's a different group of people really that now have to work together on specific policy items rather than the entirety of just elect that person. Presidents also have trouble translating their agenda into laws because the president doesn't control the legislative process. It's one of the problems with how the president is presented in our media as this sort of all-powerful person who could bomb the whatever out of any country around the world, but might not be able to get a bill passed in Congress. That part we kind of don't really spend that much time on. And the reasons for it, we also don't spend a lot of time focused on, except when it becomes really important, like on a day like today, when a piece of legislation passed. And that is that there are 435 House members and 100 senators who have very different demands driving their behavior. Congressional legislative outcomes, if we study it from their perspective, are determined by several important factors, most notably partisan politics. And people say that as if it's a bad thing, partisan politics. But in and of itself, it's not. When we're talking about Congress and parties, We're talking about how political parties organize the chamber, how it's about majority rule or unified versus divided government. Those are not necessarily bad things. But of course, when the president's party, even when the president's party controls Congress, it's not a slam dunk that the president is going to get what they want, because it's not partisanship that's the issue, it's polarization. And that's what we're experiencing right now and have been for years, this hyper partisanship, this polarized environment where you have two entrenched camps that will not compromise. And compromise or unification is what drives outcomes. And so you either are working with the other side to produce some kind of coalition, or you are desperately trying to hold on to your side and your majority such that you can pass legislation. So of course, in that scenario, the bigger the majority you have, the easier it is to be successful. Interestingly, in terms of congressional outcomes, presidential popularity does not matter as much as people think. Popularity is not something that drives members of Congress who have to explain their decision-making back home. The things that matter to them are, what does their party want? What does their constituency want? Where are we in the electoral cycle? What do interest groups want? From that perspective, the president is just somebody, just yet another person who wants something. Except, of course, for the party the president is the head of. In that case, party demands and presidential demands kind of go together. So if we look at how this plays out for presidents, I'm going to share again. We're going to take a look at President Trump and how effective he was. So this slide is showing us presidential support from Congress, meaning supporting presidential legislation, an agenda item, when the president takes a position. And so if you look at President Trump over here, 93.4% of the time when the president takes a position, Congress gave him what he wanted. And so this is pretty high. I mean, if you compare this to the other presidents here, and this is the orange stripe we're talking about, he had record support from his Republican Congress. But there's a catch to this slide, and that, it's the beauty of using percentages. What's the catch? When the president takes a position. President Trump, in comparison to all these other presidents, did not take positions very often on legislation. He only told his Republican Congress in his first 2 years in office what he wanted them to do on 18% of the votes in Congress. And most of those times, they were nominations. He was really clear on wanting his judges appointed. Everything else Congress was doing, president wasn't paying as much attention, or if he was not vocally pressing for Congress. And when you consider, what kind of support is given on more than 18%, you kind of have to wonder why President Trump was not working this in his first 2 years. And so if we look at the things on his legislative legacy, on the things he himself told us he cares about, and this is his agenda, this is what he campaigned on, and this is what he said he was going to do in his first 100 days, which if you look at this long list, it's a little ludicrous. But this was also what is going to be guiding his presidency for 4 years, because this is what he campaigned on. And so looking at this, you can see how difficult it is for a sitting president, even when your party is in control 2 of those 4 years. He hadn't had much success. He passed a few of these in part, a couple of these things, but the majority of these bills, there was no successful outcome in the legislative sphere. He only really had two. And so clearly then, President Trump was not legislatively successful in achieving his campaign agenda. Does that mean he was not successful? No, it just means that he went a different route for achieving success. And so if you were at one of my, I gave a talk a couple of, I guess now it's over a year ago? No, longer. No, I guess it was 6 months ago, talking about how President Trump often took different routes for achieving success or attempting to achieve success, that he really reshaped the institution of the presidency, although it's not clear in the end it really benefited him. And so the route that Trump took and preferred, the lane that he preferred to play in, is what we like to call the unilateral presidency. And what this refers to is when the president's able to act without Congress. So not, obviously legislation has to be produced by Congress and the president only has the opportunity to sign it or veto it. This area of power, in a sense, allows the president in the role as head of government to get the bureaucracy to act. So it's a different kind of policy making we're talking about here, but it's an equally powerful type of effect on policy making as we see with legislative. And in fact, there has been recently presidential preference for going this route because of that hyper-partisanship in Congress. And so these are the things you hear a lot, in the press. And if you were paying attention on day one of Joe Biden's presidency, you might remember him sitting at a table with a stack of things to sign, and those things were what I have listed here first, which are his executive orders. And these things here, executive orders, signing statements, rulemaking, staffing and appointments, these are all the behaviors, these are all the things that the president and the White House can do to move the behemoth that is the American federal government. And these actions, interestingly, scholars have argued, carry the force of law because there's no formal mechanism to them. Neither Congress nor the courts have really had the capacity or made the choice to rein in this type of presidential behavior. And scholars have argued then that even more so than the public presidency, this is what has shifted the balance of power towards the president and away from Congress. So what are these things? Taking them in turn, we can start with the executive orders. So what are executive orders? Executive orders are when Congress tasks the department and agencies to implement and administer the legislation they produce. One of the things that's strikingly apparent, and if we have any lawyers in the audience, you'll know that the legislation produced by a Congress that must compromise tends to be rather vague and undefined. And so the chief executive then is ultimately responsible for the implementation of legislation and making sure that the bureaucracy implements it, implements congressional intent. However, there's a lot of leeway there for presidents to interpret that implementation. And since there's a lot of leeway for the bureaucracy to implement the legislation, it gives the president a power and ability to move the bureaucracy in the direction that the president wants it to go. And so the president does this by issuing directives to the bureaucracy, which are these executive orders. So these are the amount of executive orders issued per year. And you'll notice, Biden's at 29. And that's in what he's been in office 2 months. And Donald Trump has averaged 55 a year, which was fairly high in comparison to his immediate predecessors. Jimmy Carter had more. Harry Truman and obviously Franklin Delano Roosevelt blew out the water in terms of how many directives he was issuing per year. So Donald Trump's average here is high, but it's not outsized in comparison to other presidents as an average. Now, when it comes to signing statements, we see again that President Trump wasn't out of the realm of behavior here in comparison to Obama. In fact, it was George W. Bush, which this table oddly calls him Bush Jr., which is very strange because he was not actually a junior. But what is a signing statement? A signing statement is when a president receives a piece of legislation from Congress, which has been passed by both chambers, two options: sign it or veto it. Since James Monroe was president, so a really long time, presidents have the option and have not simply signed or not signed. They have also occasionally issued commentary to go along with it about how they think it should be implemented. So unlike an executive order, which is actually a directive, this is sort of a implicit recommendation of how I think it should go, which is why clearly they don't typically use them and prefer the executive order, again, except for Bush, whose people went berserk and he essentially issued signing statements on every law that he signed. So signing statements don't have the force of law. These are much more symbolic statements, as well as being guidance for agencies. And clearly George W. Bush was making a lot of symbolic statements. So what do we have then? In the Trump administration, executive orders increased, signing statements continued to decrease from Bush, although it went up from Obama. So the third area of activity, of unilateral activity, was rulemaking, which also went down. According to the Brookings Institution, agencies under Trump significantly reduced the total amount of rulemaking relative to prior administrations across the board. And this drop was for both routine rules and important rules for both cabinet agencies and independent agencies. So this was powerfully important in the Trump administration. And if you consider the amount of failure that he had in the legislative arena, this was an opportunity where the administration was extraordinarily successful in getting the bureaucracy to do what it wanted to do, because what it wanted it to do was be less active, to do less. Normally, we think of policies as a positive thing in that you're telling somebody to do something. In this case, we're telling bureaucracy to not do it, to just not pursue things. And when you're talking about something like environmental regulation, telling the bureaucracy not to pursue environmental problems or to relax rules that had been in place was a powerful boon for business. And so the bureaucracy then was less active on existing law, and then was also less able to act because in the White House, there was less staff coordinating across the bureaucracy, and Trump had made fewer appointments. So executive orders were important, signing statements could be important, but the lack of rulemaking and the desire to have less rules, coupled with the fact that there were simply less people in the White House and in those appointed positions meant that the bureaucracy was doing less, and the direction it was getting from the top was to do less. And so when you regulate less in key areas like environmental regulation, this is significant. When you offer executive orders and rulemaking to do different, like in immigration or on oil and gas, we also got different outcomes. And then, of course, when you think about something like COVID, having fewer people to coordinate across the bureaucracy has meant that we didn't do it very well. We didn't handle the crisis well because we didn't have people to do it, and we didn't have people to manage how it was going to happen. So what does this mean for Biden? We can look at this both legislatively and unilaterally. And so when you think about it legislatively, it's pretty early, right? You know, it's way too early to think, you know, to judge Biden on how successful he's been. You know, like let's at least let him get to 100 days, right? And then we'll evaluate him. But at the same time, it's day 50, and he's had essentially his signature campaign item passed. It passed today, the House and the Senate, the COVID relief plan. Now, he didn't get everything he wanted, but most importantly, he managed to get it before the expiration of the benefits from the previous relief plan, which was going to be really important. If it actually expired and then they had to reinitialize the unemployment benefits and the other benefits, it was going to be a mess. And we already experienced what happened when that happens. And so you have to do all these short-term bills to fix things. So he got this done on time before the expiration of benefits, and it has a lot of things in it that the Democrats want. It's a fairly progressive plan, and it might end up lasting longer than the COVID crisis in terms of some of these things that the Democrats pushed for and successfully got passed. But of course, it did pass in a partisan fashion. You know, and this is what happens when you have the majority and can hold your coalition together, which, as talked about earlier, those are your two choices. You either form a bipartisan coalition, but if you couldn't manage that, hanging your majority together is equally as valuable. And you also have to understand the rules of the game. And in this case, Joe Biden understands the rules of Congress probably better than any president we've ever had or have had since Lyndon Johnson. Now, they lost in the Senate on the issue of raising the minimum wage. What did they do? They removed it from the bill, and then it passed. And they will probably revisit the idea of the minimum wage. And maybe, you know, there was already some signaling that, you know, maybe it was 15 was too much and we'll do 11. So, which at least would be something significant. So again, in terms of the 100-day factor, hitting this on day 50 is a really good win for the Biden administration. Now, if you think back to other presidents, you know, we saw that list of Trump's accomplishments, and so clearly they didn't happen in that first. The tax relief was later in the year. Obama has both Biden and Trump beat on legislation because he got it done in his first month. In the first month, he got the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, January 29th, Children's Health Insurance Reauthorization in February 4th, and of course the big piece, the stimulus package, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, February 17th. But I think Biden will take it, considering how traumatic the beginning of his term was, the focus on impeachment and all the rest of it. This was his, this is the thing. I mean, he basically could sit down now and say, well, this is what I said I was going to do. And he got it done. And that's a really big deal. But of course, that's only the legislative side of it, right? He has to manage that bureaucracy. That's what failed for us in terms of COVID. And so the fact that 2020, the injection rollouts have been rolling out with speed now, and you see the difference of when you have a bureaucracy working all in one direction, but it's still so early, they don't have their people staffing it either. So we're very thinned out at the bureaucratic level. And there's also, just as sort of a side political point, all of this would not be possible without Georgia, in that everything would be different for the Biden administration had one of those Senate seats not gone Democratic. Republican turnout was down in the state of Georgia. Democratic turnout remained as high as it was November 3rd. And so that state of Congress, where we talked about earlier, majority rule plus unified versus divided government, it was so costly. All the things that President Trump and the Republicans were focused on at the end of December and the beginning of January that led to the Democratic success. And Biden wouldn't be as successful as he was today without that win in Georgia. So if we turn from legislation to the unilateral side of things, you guys may have seen this. This was in 538. And there was really this impression that Biden has spent all of his time just undoing all of Trump's executive orders. And as you can see, it's a lot of them. And that is why presidents, prior to, it sort of started to shift under George W. Bush, but why presidents spend so much time focused on legislation. If you want an agenda, if you want a legacy, you need it to be done in Congress, because Congress, anything there, force of law, it's hard to undo. And the Republicans and President Trump learned this with Obamacare. They could not overturn that. Now, it did come down to one vote and John McCain, but it's very difficult to get rid of sitting legislation. On the other hand, executive orders, all Biden has to do is sign a new one. And so that's the problem, but also the power of executive orders. You can do them, and for your 4 years, they're the force of law. But this is why, again, it was so consequential that Biden won. Had Trump won, his executive orders would in place for 8 years, and that would have been would have made it much more equivalent to the force of law, because 8 years is a pretty long time to be operating under a pattern of lessening regulations and the diminishment of the rules, particularly on the two main issues they were focused on, the environmental side and on immigration. And so what has Biden done in this pile of revocation of Trump's executive orders? There's sort of two categories in addition to it, not just overturning, that President Biden has focused on getting rid of these executive orders that affect policies that don't align with what Biden and Harris campaigned on, their goals. But they also put into place with these executive orders what are called, they issued something that's called a freeze memo, which basically ensured that no new action can flow from what happened from Trump's previous orders. So that basically putting a stop date on in addition to the revocation of them. And thirdly, they've also released a new memo, a new order, which has been called a modernization memo. But this is about setting out their principles of regulation, what kind of regulations they want to see. And they ask the agencies to now put their proposed rules through these analytical steps that they're proposing. Cost benefit analysis, other regulatory reviews. So a whole system of policy procedures. And these two things harken back to the way the Obama White House ran its regulatory control of the bureaucracy. And so it's very much a return to that way of presidential, leadership of the bureaucracy. And it's been really significant in terms of changing the course of our policy direction. And that's really what presidential leadership is all about, and how we judge presidents. Can you get Congress, can you get the bureaucracy to do what you want to do and what you said you were going to do when you campaign? And what presidents invariably all learn, particularly if they're outsiders when they come in, is that it's really hard to do this because Congress doesn't have any incentive to help you unless it's unified party control. But as we've seen with Trump, that doesn't guarantee that you as president will get what you want. Because if Congress is not in alignment with you, it just produces a mess. And so what Biden, the position that Biden's in, very similar in a sense to the position that Trump was in when he entered, in that he's got competing wings of his party. And so the question is how do you wrangle them? How do you manage them? How do you get them all on board? And the advantage that Biden has over what Trump had is that Biden is invested in this kind of compromise. Clearly, he wants that compromise to occur with the Republican Party, but it's not only the Republican Party he has to compromise with, he has to work with his own party too. And he was quite effective at it in holding them together. So today in the House, he lost one. One Democrat didn't vote for his piece of legislation, for the reconciliation, the bill that the Senate passed. That's pretty significant. And Trump did not have that kind of loyalty across the board. But much more significant was once Trump stopped or didn't see the kind of success that he wanted on some of these important pieces of legislation, he turned to the regulatory side of things and really didn't come back to Congress. And so Congress, they passed a lot of law, he signed a lot of law, but it was not presidentially centered. It was not the president's agenda, which is why when you think about the president's campaign, he did hype the two things that they did, the tax reform and that criminal justice bill, which he talked a lot about. But again, selling regulatory reform as policy success, it's a hard sell on a campaign, which is why usually presidents are so focused on the legislative side of things. And Biden understands this. Whether he runs or not, he understands how important it is to act in the legislative arena. And if you think about it, just from the example of Obamacare, the Republicans did not vote for this. They did not want it. And one of the reasons they fought so hard instead of working to compromise is because they understood what it was going to mean once people had access to healthcare. They were not going to want to give it up. I mean, you never see people after you've received a benefit saying, oh yeah, I don't want it anymore. People hang on to it. And so that's why they fought so hard to prevent it from happening. Once it takes shape and they get Republican control, unified government and the president. Then they try to overturn it, and failing that, then they turn to the regulatory side of it and start stripping the bill, stripping the law of all of the regulatory rules that made it function. In particular with the exchanges, and that's where you go to buy insurance and all of those things, they really kind of starved it. And to the surprise of everybody, the legislation was well crafted and it survived being starved, even though the healthcare that was offered was not as effective as it had been under the Obama administration. And of course, now with Biden back and the Obama-Biden perspective back in office, you know, the ACA is going to, I don't know, what's the opposite of being starved? Fattened up. It will be, you know, well supported by Congress and by the bureaucracy. Although note that Biden never calls it Obamacare. He now calls it the ACA because, of course, he's now president. It's good to be president. So there were a couple of questions in the chat. And Michael asked, weren't a number of Trump's rulemakings challenged successfully in the courts? Yes, they were. And that is because when you do an executive order, when this is a bureaucratic decision, there are two ways you can challenge this. You can challenge it on its constitutionality or on the law that it stems from. So yes, you can take this to the court, but there are so many rules that a lot of things happen while this is making it through the court. Famously, all the immigration issues were handled this way, but there are so many things that took place, particularly on the environmental side of things, that are still slowly working its way through the courts because because it wasn't about people in the same way, it didn't have to have that immediate reaction. But yes, some of his rules were effectively and successfully challenged, and I wouldn't be surprised if more of them keep getting undone, but that takes time. All of these policies have been enacted. And significant things have happened. I mean, if you think in West Virginia, the relaxing of the rules of what companies can dump in this one river, you know, if it gets overturned in the court system, you know, that's fine. And it's stopped by the Biden administration, that's fine. The stuff's still been dumped in the river. People, you know, the people of West Virginia are still drinking it. So, you know, the people in Flint, Michigan are, you know, who decided to poison their water, they're going to jail, but people still suffered from it. So, I mean, there are real powerful consequences that sometimes take a long time to get those policies undone. Oh my gosh, Biden's management of the COVID vaccine rollout fit into his analysis. Well, you know, I think he is effectively using the tools available to him to roll out the process, to roll out the vaccine. And I think, for example, getting Merck to agree to produce the J&J vaccine, I think is a powerful example of what the president can do when he's invested in the conversation. I think more in terms of, you know, my work is mostly on my main research area is on presidential communications. And COVID was such a disaster in terms of public leadership by the Trump administration that simply being coherent across the board from the president through the scientists and through the managers of how this is rolling out, that there's a unified voice. That is so powerful in terms of improving the this policy, that you know, it just really demonstrates the difference of understanding how to use and direct and move the bureaucracy. You know, and unless you're going to argue that Trump didn't want that to happen. And I think that's just a step too far, although people will go there. It seems, but it's by the time COVID rolls around, right, we're 4 years into his administration. And so the habits, the behaviors, they're already there. And you can't suddenly turn around and say, okay, now we're going to be coordinated, cohesive, and we're going to have a full-on institutional response, because they just don't have it. They don't have the ability to create it out of thin air. And you need leadership to do that, and a leader who actually cares about that. And while they were effective, and again, this is, what's so interesting to me on this is that, so many Republicans for years and years and years talked about the big bloated federal government and starving it and all of this stuff and how we needed to undo it. And that would make our economy so much more vigorous. But no Republican president ever actually did that. Even Ronald Reagan, talking about how the bureaucracy is the problem. All of them expanded their institutions, expanded the number of people they put in their bureaucracy, because that gives you presidential power. It gives you more power. And your executive orders designed to give more power to the presidency. Trump was the first who really said, you know what, let's just get rid of all of it. I mean, and this is, sort of the businessman talking, where, all regulations are bad because they cost business money. I'm not sure people expected how effective it would be to simply not staff the political appointee positions within the government. And then those people who were there turn out to be, super Trump loyalists and very much advancing policy by lessening regulations and shrinking rulemaking. So, different learning curve, because he's already very knowledgeable about the tools of government. I think that's true. And, it's one of the arguments that is always made by people who are insiders when they're running for higher office. I mean, if you think about our mayoral campaign, which we're already being buried in ads for, I'm sure everybody's seeing those already, that, people are already starting to argue, as an insider, I have experience and we need experience. Whereas outsider candidates are saying, you don't want somebody trapped by that insider or captured by the bureaucracy and unable to make new and change our path, make new decisions and change our path forward. In that chart, I think this idea that Trump somehow didn't learn how to become more effective. It's a really interesting question, this idea of Trump as president and what effectiveness means, and whether or not we need a different language, different variables to describe Trump. He did not view the presidency the way presidents before him did. And so his definition of success was clearly different. Otherwise, he wouldn't have stripped the things that give presidents power from the office. And so it's one of the things that my most recent book is about, the fact that the presidents have gained power by creating a very impressive public management office, communications strategy. And Trump threw all that out because he wanted a tweet. And he liked being in charge of it, being in control of it. But the result of it was incoherent. It was not coordinated across the institutions. I mean, have you been hearing in the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of media focus on, and particularly Democratic media focus on infrastructure. When was it going to be infrastructure week? That this was a joke through the 4 years of the president's term. Because every time they started infrastructure week, Trump would tweet about something else, completely redirect the conversation, and basically blow up all the work of the lower level staffers. And so when we talk about a higher level of effectiveness and skill, we're talking not just about the president, but also the management of the White House institution, and the staff. And so the president should have gained skill in doing that, but did not. And part of it was because his people kept leaving. There was this revolving exit door. And so he might have started out with, there was some discussion whether he actually started out with the A team. But the A team doesn't always make it through the 4 years because it's very difficult to work in the White House. It's very stressful. But usually they last longer than Trump's people did. So then you got to the B+ team, then the B, then the B-. And, on the day of the insurrection, I mean, we had people in acting positions and people who weren't actually knowledgeable about what they were supposed to be doing. For example, at the head of the Department of Homeland Security, which turned out to be really important, that we didn't have somebody who knew what they were doing on January 6th. So for Biden, he's got a tough road to hoe with 50-50 Senate. And he's, we're not in a great place as a country right now. But if you're going to look at the halfway point of his 100 days, he's probably feeling really good today. Because if you look at his approval numbers, they're high. The approval for this bill is high, really high. That's a source of power for the president. And if they use it well, they're going to keep motoring on and knocking off all of these legislative options, which is going to prove potentially helpful for 2022. And one of the things I would say, the Obama agenda was devastated by the Tea Party and 2010. And so if the people who want to see Biden doing what he's doing do not turn up in 2022, it's done. So part of the drill here, part of the deal is that Biden has to work for Congress, for his Democratic Congress, and work to expand his coalition in order to lift the boats of his party and then ultimately to get reelected. We've not had a president who's chosen to not run for reelection and to state it. And so we have to assume he's going to be running for reelection and that he's behaving the way presidents do when they do that, which means doing things that people want and basically getting rewarded for doing so. Are there any other questions? We can open it up. We can actually let people talk other than me. Leonard, do you have a question?
Actually, I was saying goodbye because I thought that's what you were doing. But I'll stay for a few more minutes to see if there are comments. You're unmuted. You're muted.
So I guess they automatically mute me when somebody else is talking. So, which is actually very polite. It's a very nice thing. So any other questions that anybody would like to ask? We had some good ones in the chat. But if not, I would say thank you so much for coming. It was a pleasure to have you here and to actually, I continue to be impressed that people actually want to still hear and talk about politics after the year and a half that we've all had. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Diane. Thanks, everyone.